Hey folks, Michael Mann from Michael Mann Security Services. Welcome to Civil Unrest in Houses of Worship, preparing for protests and demonstrations. I'm looking at my phone. We still got people registering through Eventbrite, so people are probably just now jumping on. So as always, let's talk about how you get a hold of us. All right, michaelmannsecurityservices.com is the website. 615-606-1006 is how to get a hold of us. That's Scott. He can answer whatever questions you have. You can get Scott at scottm@michaelmannsecurityservices.com, or you can get me at contact@michaelmannsecurityservices.com, and we'll try to answer you as quick as possible. Or you can always go to Facebook and Instagram and get us at Safe with Man. Quickest way to probably get a hold of us is that message on Facebook or through Facebook. All right. All right, certified protection. I'm sorry. Before we start with the presentation, talk about what we got coming up. We started our CPP certification study module about 2 weeks ago, so I've been running that for a second week this past Monday. Going very well. We've got some folks from churches throughout the country, synagogues, and then of course security professionals from Middle Tennessee, Texas, and some and other locations. It's not too late. If you don't know what the CPP is, you probably don't want to join the study group. But if you do, and you're looking to get some assistance with knowing what to study and how to pass that pretty comprehensive exam, then send us an email and we'll send you information on it. Okay. All right. If you're in Middle Tennessee, this Friday, October the 9th, we've got our urban rifle class. 4 hours manipulating the gun, fighting with a gun, manipulating this weapon in your household. That's $75. That will be here in Brentwood, Tennessee. We still have slots. Sign up through Eventbrite. You can find it on the webpage. All right, our most important class outside of our standards, which is the CPS, Behavioral Based Threat Detection Module 1. This is the old ISC, or Israeli Security Concept 1. We've added a lot of content. We've just changed the name so it's not so confusing. That is Sunday, October the 11th. So that's next Sunday, 1 to 4:30 p.m. That is an online event, our virtually instructor-led training session. That is $60. And again, we've added a whole bunch of content to that. This is the most important class, or the two classes. There's two modules that you can take as a security professional. I don't care if you're protecting a church, you're protecting a manufacturing site, doesn't matter. This is our preventative strategy. Very important class. If you're in security, you should look at taking the class. All right, CPS Module 1, we're starting this over again. So we've had numerous groups go through CPS Module 1, 2, and 3. They have received their certification. There is now a 2-year renewal certification process with CPS. We've added a lot more content to this, including in CPS Module 1 and 2. So we're starting this over. So we just had a group finish 3 modules. We've got a group in Module 3 starting next week. And so we're starting over again October the 25th. This is a virtually instructor-led session. This is from 2 to 6. It is 4 hours. In fact, it probably take a little bit longer now because we've added the certification for management of aggressive behavior. And so we've added to the testing process and the content. So that is $100 because of the content that's added and the additional certifications that you're going to get out of this outside of the CPS certification. That is October the 25th, and again, that is 100% online, or we can come to your church if you're in Middle Tennessee or within driving distance of Middle Tennessee. All right, so to the meat of what we're doing. So civil unrest and houses of worship. So here's what to expect, folks. This is a general guideline to help you prepare your house of worship for civil unrest. I did this for the nuclear industry when I managed programs for both commercial, nuclear, and chemical. So prepared for protests. We had protests that I had to deal with from the security side. So I'm going to take that template and give it to you guys. There's 2 parts to this, so we're going to take about 30 minutes. We're going to talk about threat and likelihood of this, what this looks like for you guys, because as you know, I'm a risk guy. So I'll walk you through that threat or likelihood piece. I've got considerations, and then what you're really going to be interested in is the assessment and review phase of this process. So it's like a checklist, but I'm going to walk you through it and explain it to you step by step. And then, of course, at the end, we're going to have a Q&A. Scott is here, so he's going to watch the questions at the end. So if you have any, I'll answer those. So he'll read them off to me, then I will repeat them and answer the questions at the end of the Q&A. So I say 30 to 40 minutes. But if this takes an hour and a half, I don't care. If you've got the time, I've got the time. That's how much we think of you, all right? So, no, we're glad you're here. We appreciate it. Okay. All right, so let's get into the considerations. Let's talk about it. All right, so let's talk about the threat piece of this. So number one considerations: the threat or likelihood for civil unrest happening at your house of worship, your synagogue, your mosque, your ministry, whatever. So number one, understand the cross, the crescent moon and the stars, the Star of David. All that is offensive to the world. It's about faith. Faith is a very offensive to the world. It always has been. So that's a consideration. We talk about likelihood. That's always there. But understand now the destruction of churches, of synagogues, of ministries is now being called for. So if you start to watch the news with this violent leftist movement that's been around for a long time, we've talked about that in our left-wing terrorism ideology webinar several weeks back. So you can go back and review that if you haven't and see what we talked about with that. All this plugs in together. And so now the destruction of churches are being called for. So because of that, now the likelihood, of course, the cross, the Star of David, everything's always been offensive. Now the destruction of these institutions are now being called for, and the adversary has the capability to both plan and execute these attacks. Now, when I say attacks, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're shooting the building up, but this civil unrest or this disruption is an attack on the church. It's an attack on the synagogue, the mosque, whatever. Okay. Churches have been vandalized. They've been attacked. You're going to see a video we've shown before here shortly illustrating that fact. And the Supreme Court nomination process coming up. From my understanding, I think this young lady is Catholic. That is, obviously there is faith there. You can't attack her professionally, plus she has a very nice family. They are going to, and they're doing it now, they're going to attack her faith, and they're going to continue to attack that. So if we look at what has happened, what is being called for, and what is coming, the likelihood of the threat of this is increased really greatly if we start to look at 6 months ago. So there is a likelihood this can happen at your ministry, your church, your synagogue, your mosque, your temple. So start to pay attention. So we're going to walk you through, after the considerations, a checklist you need to start to pay attention to prepare yourself for this. Okay, so the next consideration, adversary. Remember the agenda for the adversary that we are discussing right now. Karl Marx very specifically called for the abolishment of all religion. He called religion the opium of the people. It makes them feel good. It makes them feel better. It makes them do things that they normally would not do because of faith. So Karl Marx, who is the author of a lot of this, called for the abolishment of religion. All right, so the adversary's agenda, you got to remember that. They're in the threat spectrum now. 2, remember, this adversary is trying to gain an audience. Go back to the left-wing terrorism ideology webinar. We talked about this in detail. So if you haven't seen that again, go back and review it. We get into this, and there's videos and photos, all kinds of cool stuff. And the other objective is to create an overreaction from us. So there's been churches that have been vandalized. We've had churches where these folks have shown up and they've caused disruption, and it's been very calm. From our side, they are waiting for an overreaction, just another objective. So some things to think about, or considerations when we're talking about the adversary and we talk about the civil unrest or civil disturbance. All right? The consideration here, remember, avoidance is the key to success for us. Okay, before I get into the checklist and finish the considerations, look, if you think this is happening, you can always close the church. But again, we need to go over this so you can understand this, because they might just show up. You don't know what's happening. You don't know what's going to happen. Or you might get word it's going to happen. Maybe the church allows it. We'll talk about that. So number one, early detection of adversary activity. What are your capabilities to do this, and what is your focus on training? We talked about this before. The use of deadly force is probably not going to be authorized in this. And so what's the focus you're training? What is your detection capabilities currently with your ministry or with your team? Open source information. We covered this in, gosh, what webinar was that? It had to do with civil unrest. So in the civil unrest series, I talked about open source information and where to go get the information. So go back, review that webinar. It's all free. Go back and review that, very specifically Rally List, some other open source stuff. Go back and review that open source information, so you need to be looking at that. So review that stuff in prior webinars, and that's going to help you through this process. Remember, your main objective is prevention. So we want to avoid it. If we know it's coming, just close the church. But maybe you can't do that. Maybe the church is going to allow it, or maybe you're just not going to. So we want to prevent this. So what are your physical security standards? You've heard me talk about this before. We're talking about our concentric rings, our physical protection system, and of course we're talking about conflict avoidance. Deterrence, gathering information, documentation. So gathering information, what are you doing when you're out there on post? So when you gather that, what do you do with it? So we talk about gathering. How do we document that? That's in our suspicious activity report, and then you should be pushing that information out. Again, what's the focus of your training? The gun stuff here is not going to work. You're trying to prevent something. Okay? Just a quick review of our behavior-based threat detection training. You guys have seen this on our webpage. This is what you need to focus on. Seeing the threat, identifying the problem, minimizing the vulnerability that you currently have to not see this, detecting these things early, and preventing not responding. You can go to our website for $60. You can see you can roll a day. You can learn how to do this, and again, minimize or mitigate the impact if this were actually to happen, or if this is a threat to your church. Okay? All right, considerations. The church is private property. Let me get into why we're talking about this. We'll get into this when we talk about use of force later. We're talking about if it's vandalism or they do something, these are property crimes. I don't know of any state, unless it happens to be special nuclear material, where if someone destroys property, the use of deadly force is authorized. You can't do that unless there's another crime being committed and someone's life is in risk of death or serious bodily injury. So this is the church's property. It's private property. And so we're talking about property crimes. So we have to be careful about our response, what this looks like, even when they show up. Protest on private property must be sanctioned events. They just can't show up and do this. You have the right as a church to say, no, you can't come on the property and do it. So it must be sanctioned by the property owner or by the person's leasing the property, or here it's going to be the church. So you have to okay them to come on the property to do this. So this is going to be important later on when we start talking about planning. Okay? When we start to talk about private property, the church or the protection of the church is your responsibility. It's nobody else's. Private property means private protection. It's one of the great things about living in this country. All right? The police are not required to respond to your church. Let me say that again. They're not required to respond. It's really a voluntary service, something the government provides to investigate crimes. But constitutionally, there's no requirement for them to show up. So number one, this is our responsibility. You're going to have to figure this out. And if they show up and they start protesting, what are you going to do? Because number one, the police may not respond. And number two, if they do, it's ineffective. I'm going to show you a video of ineffective response. You've seen it before. And not from a shooting, from a protest for a church. And if you look at this and you're like, what are you talking about? Watch the protests have been going on for months. The police are standing there, not necessarily because they want to, but that's their orders from a higher authority. And maybe some of them don't want to respond. Maybe some of them don't want to fight back. I'm telling you this to make you understand, and you hear this from me all the time, this is your responsibility. The day of the volunteer church or ministry security person that shows up to volunteer to get hot coffee and sit through an NRA presentation in a classroom, folks, those days are coming to an end. These should be professional security folks standing post, and you decide how that works. It's your responsibility as the leader of the ministry to make sure this is happening. This is happening on private property. It's your responsibility. It's my responsibility to respond to that or prevent it. All right? Your response, we talked about this already, may not require the use of deadly force. So again, the NRA presentation, the gun range time that everybody wants to do with their free coffee, that's ineffective here. That ain't going to work. You're probably not going to be able to use or be allowed to use deadly force because of the level of a threat during a protest or civil unrest. Okay? So what are your team's capabilities outside of the pistol? Number one, it should think about prevention. Number two, What if they do have to tell somebody to leave, or they have to put their hands on somebody? Does the security ministry actually have the ability to do that? Now, again, remember, you can shut the church down if you know this is coming. You can avoid all this, but we're talking about, or we're discussing if this happened and what you would have to do and the things you need to think about. Number two, what are they prepared to do? You know, it's one thing to watch this on TV and get mad when things get burnt down and say, I would do this. It's a very different thing when you're standing post and 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 people show up and start protesting and doing things in the parking lot, and now you're the only person standing between them and the congregation. It's a very different environment, folks. I tell people all the time, this ain't Facebook. It's not social media. Like, I read something, I can respond. Well, it's safe on Facebook. When you're out there standing post in the real world and you decided to take that responsibility to safeguard your congregants and your church, it's a whole different ball game. So what are they prepared to do? What does this mean? This is a video of the attack. This is an attack of the church in New York a couple months ago. They started outside. I'm not sure how they got inside, but they came inside. They caused a disruption. They're cussing out the security team or whoever this element is that's trying to deal with them. You notice the police are in the background. They're not doing anything. They're finally trying to get them out, but until it almost got physical, the police did absolutely nothing. They're just kind of standing by. I'm not sure why the folks are inside the church to start with, because they were being disruptive outside, but this is what could happen. What is your team prepared to do, and what could they do? Because here, when I look at this, there's no authorization for the use of deadly force. What are you going to do, and what are you prepared to do? Okay? And this just kind of keeps worse. It starts to snowball, and finally they start to leave. Okay? Now let's talk about the assessment and review phase. So kind of flew through that. I want to get to the checklist part for you guys. And this is not as comprehensive as I want it to be or wanted it to be, but we limit these to 30 to 40 minutes. If not, we'd be talking here for 2 or 3 hours. So I'm going to go through like kind of a checklist process for you guys, and what this assessment or what this review piece would look like as you're going through the process to plan for something like this. Not only plan, but of course prevent it. So let's talk about the planning stages of this. Number one, review your open source intelligence. Like, periodically do that. Don't wait for somebody to say, hey, somebody's coming to town to start protesting. Don't wait for that. Start to review the open source documents or open source resources that we've talked about in other webinars to see what this looks like for you and your church. So open source documents. Talk to your law enforcement folks. They might have heard something, or they're probably going to hear before other people do, because of fusion centers and because of info that they're getting off the street that this may be coming. So look, they don't have time to come to you. They're not going to have time to go to every church and warn every church that somebody's coming to protest. So, like, make contact with your law enforcement folks and your fusion center to find out what may be happening or what's about to happen inside your city or your jurisdiction. SAR, suspicious activity reports. What are you doing with those? Are you documenting activity that you see that could be pre-attack surveillance or pre-protest surveillance? So if you're doing that, what are you doing with the reports? Who are you communicating those to or with? And what does that mean for the church ministry? Okay, so review your intelligence, number one. That's going to start to give you indications of who's coming, what's coming, is it going to impact your church, or could it potentially impact your church? Number two, identify the potential scenarios here. Now again, if you know it's coming, you can shut the church down and have to worry about it, but maybe the church decides it's not going to shut down. Maybe you don't know you're the target or you're going to be a target. Maybe they're going to be somewhere else and they just decide to walk down the street and hit your property. Okay, so what are the scenarios if you determine this is a problem? Number one, could it be a protest during services? Am I prepared for it? Number two, is it a protest during the week? So when staff's present. So the congregation's not there, but they show up during the week when there's staff members there only. Is it going to be an after-hours act of vandalism, which has happened as they tear down statues, break into churches, try to burn them down? This was actually a problem before all the civil unrest. We talked about acts of terrorism against the church, which was what, Scott, seven webinars ago, I think, terrorism in the church. Yeah, we specifically talked about this, and now this is happening. And so it was happening then, but now what's happening is kind of more out in the open. So what does that mean? What is the potential scenario? So once you've reviewed your open source intelligence and now you've looked at the potential scenarios, the next step is to determine scope of liability. So now it's time to get, now you can kind of, the next slide, you can kind of take these and move them around. But now would be the time to probably talk to the church, and we'll talk about that, but determine the scope of liability. So what does that mean? This gets into last week's webinar. We're talking about contacting your insurance provider. So last week we talked about you've got two types of liability insurance at church. You've got the general liability insurance. It's covering accidents, motor vehicle accidents, slip, trips, and falls, whatever. Lightning strikes the church and it catches on fire. Then there's your security operations liability insurance. This is where we're talking about with this. Really kind of falls into both, especially if there's damage done to the church. So contact them. What are the expectations based on intelligence scenarios, etc.? So if you share this with the insurance provider, what are the expectations from them? Number two, determine the best path forward, both spiritually, physically, and socially, from a social standpoint. So what that means is, like spiritually, is it going to be the right thing for us to do, shut the church down? Physically, is that the best thing because there's a threat to property damage and we don't want any of our congregants to be injured or for them to be embarrassed or be fearful? And then socially, what does that mean to close the church down? Okay, so like socially, what's the social impact in the community if you shut it down for this? All right, so determine the best scope, or actually the best path forward, after you share these things with the insurance company and see what they say. From a risk standpoint, they're probably going to tell you just shut it down. Now go to church leadership. So now what we've done, we've identified the potential threat through open source intelligence. What we've done is we've created our scenarios based on what we know. We've talked to the insurance company. You may talk to the church first because the church may want to be part of that conversation with the insurance company. But now we're going to consult with church leadership. And what that means is I want to identify the concerns and expectations that they have. So potentially this could happen. So what does that mean? What are the response protocols if this were to happen? Now, again, maybe you haven't identified this is going to happen in the church. Maybe that they're going to protest some facility that's a block or 2 blocks down the road, and they've decided not to close the church, and this actually becomes a peripheral threat for you guys. And then it comes to fruition like it does happen. So what are the response protocols? What does the church expect from the ministry? Number two, are they even going to allow the protest? Maybe they will. Like maybe they will allow the protest off property across the street because that's legal, right? So maybe they'll allow it to happen. Are they going to close the church? What does that mean? What does that mean for you guys? If they close the church and the protest happens, do you still need to be there? What are the expectations of the ministry or from church leadership? Expectations for the ministry after worship hours. So if you've identified this as a threat, one of your scenarios is, look, somebody's going to show up maybe while they're in town protesting. They're going to try to tear the cross down. They're going to burn the church down. Church doesn't have the funds to hire LEOs off duty or law enforcement officers. What are expectations for the ministry to protect this in this amount of time from some sort of vandalism after hours? Is that an expectation for the ministry? Number two, is this a value-added service that the ministry could provide? Do you have volunteers that are willing to do this outside of Sunday night, Wednesday, or Saturday? What does that mean? Okay. Assess your ability to control access to the property. Now, I know most of us don't have gates, but what that means is if there is a protest somewhere close or it's across the street, or you're worried about stuff at nighttime, how do you control access to the property while you're there and maybe while you're not there? So, again, I'm not big on target hardening. I'm big on security by design. And what that means is determine where the private space of the church ends and the public space begins, because that's like your line, right? And so this is kind of a septet principle, but determine where the private property ends and the public space begins. That's the first step in this. Number two, do you have any barriers in place? Whether this is at nighttime and you're worried about vandalism and keeping people off the property, or it's like during services and you're afraid somebody's going to show up and protest. What are you doing? What do you have currently in place to stop somebody from coming on the property, even if you told them not to? Okay. The use of existing resources. If there's not a barrier, you're going to use something you already have. If you don't have a gate or a fence, is there something else you can use that you've already got where you don't have to spend any money because you may not have it? And then what about paying for off-duty law enforcement? So remember, I told you they don't have to show up. And maybe they can't. Maybe they're going to be, if it's going to happen in your city, they're going to be tied up there. So if that's the case, maybe you have to hire off-duty police officers, the folks that aren't working the protest already at some other location. So what's the cost of that? Do the police department even have the officers free to do it that day because they may be tied up somewhere else? Or maybe if you've been told or you figure out this is going to happen at your church or it's going to happen across the street, you don't have officers there, or you're going to have to pay to have an officer or officers there that day to make sure everything goes right, and if there's an arrest, they're there to do that. So what does that mean from a resource perspective? So assess your ability to control access to the property, and what does that look like if we're going to pay law enforcement to do that? Assess the church's lockout ability. So there's a difference between a lockdown and a lockout. Lockout, again, this is a continuation of access. So assessing your access control. So a lockdown means like we're locking all the doors, somebody's hiding under the table. The lockout means we're just going to keep people out. The people that don't belong there, we're going to keep them out during service or whenever. So what that means is, what's your concentric rings of protection look like to help keep them out? What you're physically doing, your physical security strategy. Response guidelines for volunteers. The volunteers are out there serving, and then these people show up. What does that mean? What do they do? How do they communicate that? What are they supposed to break if you're practicing concentric rings, do they break that outer ring and fall in to protect the middle ring, or what do they do? What does that mean? What are your protocols for this? What are your response guidelines for the volunteers? Ability to secure the external door. So they show up, you do have to break down or fall back. Can you lock all the doors quickly? What does that look like, and can you do that? And then, of course, what does this mean for ingress and egress? Not only for the congregation if they're there, but legally, what does that mean? If you're falling back, locking doors, what does all that mean from a legal standpoint and from your fire codes? So some things to think about as we start to prepare for the protests. Okay. Determine law enforcement capabilities. We kind of talked about this in considerations, but I would want to meet with a local PD. So if they're coming, if a protest is coming to your town, you think there's a threat, or you've been threatened, or you figured out through open source that there's a protest that's going to happen at your ministry, even if it's across the street, I want to make sure who has jurisdiction, what departments. Can the sheriff's office do this? Is the city police department going to do it? Can we bring in reserve officers? What does that mean, or can the department? Number 2, trespass notifications. If we go back to considerations, a church is private property, and a protest must be a sanctioned event, which means the property owner has got to say it's okay to do that on this property. And then if they show up, even if they're doing this across the street, if they show up, that trespass notification is going to be something that the police are going to help you with. They show up, you tell them to leave, and they don't. What does that mean from the police department? Are they going to make an arrest for trespassing? Okay. Ability to respond when contacted. So, like, they're not available to help you, but if you call them and said, hey, we need you out here because it's getting out of hand, can they get there quick enough? What does that look like? Are they going to be tied up in another part of town? Are they even available? I mean, we live in Middle Tennessee. Metro, when I was there, had about 1,400 sworn police officers plus 500 or 600 non-sworn personnel. They don't have enough to deal with what they're dealing with now. But most cities, and then, of course, in Williamson County here in Brentwood, we've got an excellent police department, small, but the city's small, but most cities don't have large police departments. So if you're in a smaller location, you have a smaller police jurisdiction, can they even get there? On-duty, off-duty, we've talked about that. You might have to hire off-duty officers to do that. What does the cost mean? Is it just cheaper to close the church? Or, like I said, maybe it's happening somewhere else and you want to hire off-duty officers to be on site at your church that Sunday or Wednesday just in case. Level of enforcement. What are they going to do? How are they going to react? If they show up, if protesters show up, they start acting the way they did up in Troy, New York, what are the police going to do? What are they going to do? How are they going to respond? What's their department? What directives have they got or they received based on what's happening right now? Are they afraid to do anything? Right? So I'd want to know what that means. I'd want to meet with the police department and figure this out, especially if I'm paying for services. And then prosecution. What does prosecution mean? If they see the crime, are they going to prosecute? Are they going to make the arrest? Are they going to deal with the citations? Or are you going to have to sign that paperwork and you're going to have to go back to testify against these folks? Figure out what that means for you guys. I know we're going to get questions about this. I tried to throw this in here because, again, we talk about this for 2 hours, but review the ministry's use of force policy. If you don't have one, you need to have one. I don't care if you're armed or unarmed. If you're providing protective services and you don't have a use of force policy, you need to get one. And that doesn't mean copy one offline. With that Google or get a police officer to write one for you based on their policy, based on your capabilities, what your mission and scope is, and what they've been trained on. That's going to be the scope of your policy. So what you're doing, what your capabilities are, the training they've received, that's what your policy is going to look like. If you copy one off of the internet or borrow somebody else's, it may not apply. Okay? So determine your role during the protest. What's the ministry's role going to be, and what does that mean? Okay? So are they going to be standing by? Are they just going to be on the perimeter? If you've got off-duty officers or on-duty officers, are they going to step in and do all the work, or are you going to be required to protect the site or actually respond yourself? Okay? The current standards. Are they prepared to do this? Have you trained your team to deal with this? As I go through this and ask these questions, some of you are going, oh my gosh, we've only been doing this for 6 months. We had some basic training on situational awareness. We've got a couple of posts, and we don't even do roll call. What do you mean? How do we do this? So, some of you folks may not be able to do all this, but as I go through this checklist, I want you to understand how complicated this can get. And again, remember, the days of showing up and saying, I'm on the security team, and you watch the NRA PowerPoint, those days are done. All right? Especially with the threats that we may be facing today and now. All right? What are the team's capabilities? Like, what can they do and what they can't do, and what's considered reasonable? As a private citizen, when people come on site, what is reasonable? And remember, reasonable, we talk about use of force, is the minimal amount of force to overcome an opposing force. So what's reasonable for your team, and what are their capabilities? Certifications and documentation, if they use that reasonable force, have they been trained in that level of force? Have they been certified? Is that documented somewhere? Because I can guarantee at some point somebody's going to complain, and somebody's going to try to sue at some point, somewhere. Okay? Now, you guys probably saw this in the news. I told you that, I don't want to say I told you. I showed you this video several webinars ago, and I said, here's the problem. They're waving the guns at people. It's not that they got out to protect their property. It's the social impact of taking a muzzle and pointing it at. Well, guess what? They just got indicted. They got indicted on a reckless charge because of what they were doing, because they were pointing muzzles at protesters. And I've seen on some of the Facebook pages, people are like, they didn't prosecute any of the people that broke the law and vandalized the property and went in. It doesn't matter. What matters is you, who's protecting the church. So what are your actions, what that looks like? And I brought this up again several weeks ago when this happened. I said, what's going to get them in trouble is the social impact. Muzzles are being pointed at people, and the use of deadly force is not authorized here. Not that we can see. So again, think about what are your capabilities, what's your use of force policy, what are you going to do, what can you do, how is it going to be done? That's a whole lot of stuff. That's a big checklist. I want to open this up for questions, because as I put this webinar out and people saw it, I saw in some of our feedback on our page, people said they were going to have questions about use of force. So I'm going to open that up now. Scott, do we have anything right away?
We do. Mike in Texas.
Mike in Texas, yep.
He's asking, when it comes to hardening our facilities, what are the priorities? His church is on 3 city blocks with 5 buildings. He can collapse down to about 2, but what should he do?
Yeah, hey, like anything else, Mike, thanks for the question. If you didn't hear Scott ask, Mike in Texas said that their church is on about 3 city blocks. Is that what he said? He wants to know whether the priorities are 5 city blocks. Sorry, 5 buildings on 3 city blocks. All right. So, Mike, here's the answer. Just like our prevention strategy, we're going to start from the outside. So start on the perimeter. What are your capabilities? Can you shut traffic down from the outside? Go into the middle, that middle portion or layer, which is the buildings. So now we're going to start talking about, can you do a lockout? Can you lock the doors? You're going to have people physically there to stop them from coming inside. And then we go inside. If something happened on the inside, how can you get the congregation out? How can you get the pastor out, ingress and ingress? And then if they got inside, how are you guys going to deal with them? So start from the outside and just start to work your way in. What gates are you going to need? You're going to put cars out there. What's it look like at the skin of the building? What's it look like once they get inside the lobby? What's it look like once they get inside the sanctuary? Okay, and if that's not detailed enough, send us an email. We'll send you an email with detailed bullet points on it. Okay. Any other questions?
Yes, our good friend Perry. So he's asking if we have a webinar on developing a use of force policy, and we do.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe elaborate on that a little bit on developing a use of force policy.
Yep. So Perry, church out here in Franklin, his entire team went through CPS. Again, I can't thank Perry and their team enough for that. Went through the entire certification, so now they have a standard. So we asked very specifically about designing or developing your own use of force policy. So again, I kind of talked about it. Let me kind of take you through it, Perry. So number one, this is all going to be based on what you've been trained and certified on, one, and number two, the tools that you already have. And so, and of course, what your church leadership is going to allow you to do. So first of all, number one, what's the state say? So I'm kind of answering this generally for Perry, but also for everybody on here. So number one, what's the state say about private citizens? State of Tennessee, you can use force to effect an arrest, or you can use force to protect yourself. So number one, what state laws say? Number two, what training and certification have you been through? What is your standard? So if you got certified as an armed guard in the state of Tennessee, and you've got your pistol permit, you've got your baton stuff, what does that mean? So what do you have on site? What have you been certified with? What's documented? And so I would add that into the report. Hey, look, or into the policy. This is what our capabilities are, and this is what we're going to use. And then, of course, now we go through that use of force continuum, which is your guidelines, which is a guideline that you guys are going to use to tell you how much force you can use in a given situation. And so how we start to look at that is we start to look at deterrence. What's that mean? You know, that first level of force really for us is going to be our physical presence. What does that mean? That means what post are you going to be standing, how you're going to address those protesters. Then we start to get into verbal compliance, what we would tell them, the language we use, and maybe even come up with a script in your policy for that. Then we would go into open hand control. What does that mean? Is that escort positions? Is that like hard empty hand control where we're using other things? Then we get into impact weapons and then the use of deadly force. But again, all this is predicated upon what you've been trained and certified in. You have that documented, and of course, is there certification somewhere in your state allows it? Okay, so a lot of stuff thrown out there in a couple minutes to try to answer the question. But again, Perry, just shoot me an email and I'll respond back to you. Any other questions? Okay, all right. Hey, a lot of information in 39 minutes. We hope that this was helpful, like we hope all of our webinars are. These plug into all of our other webinars, folks. So if you've got questions about left-wing terrorism, use of force, the stuff we talked about, these videos, all of that's on prior videos or webinars. If you have no resources, I mentioned this in our preferred content last night. We had a number of people come in to pay to view a training session we had last night on actually developing your ministry. This is free training for you guys. It's on our website. It's on our YouTube page. The only one that's not on the YouTube page is the insurance webinar we did last week. They took it down for whatever reason. We have protested that, or we filed an appeal to try to get that back on. But it's still on our web. Is it on our web page?
No, I can't put it on the webpage either. So
Okay. Okay. We'll find a way, but we'll find a way to get that back out. But the only one that's not out there is going to be the insurance one. That's because YouTube, for whatever reason, took it down. I don't know if it's because we had U.S. Law Shield in there talking. I don't know, but we'll try to get that back out to you guys. Any other questions while we're sitting here running my mouth?
yes. So
Yep.
Ray Willis says frequently protesters are extremely vulgar and with their language and everything. Right? So is there any additional laws or protections to use when minors are present, especially in schools?
Yep. So Ray, where's Ray from?
I don't know.
Ray Wills.
Wills,
Yep, Ray Wills is asking a question with protesters. A lot of times they use vulgar language, and there's some additional laws that are in our favor that would help us to be able to stop this, or I guess respond to the spot, especially small children around, especially at a school or maybe a children's ministry. So yeah, so anytime, most states, if someone's outside, they're cussing, they're screaming, they're yelling, especially on private property, and they're using vulgar language, most of the time, that's disorderly in nature, and that is a misdemeanor charge. So yes, Ray, in most states that is illegal or can be considered illegal, and that is a misdemeanor committed in your presence. So you just need to review your state laws on either disorderly conduct or causing like civil unrest. It's going to be under one of those two statutes. More than likely, probably disorderly conduct. or disruptive behavior. If you look up those two or those three elements, you'll probably find the state law for that. So yes, cussing and yelling in public causing disturbance in most states is a misdemeanor crime. Any other questions? Nope. Okay, folks, thanks. We've got a lot of preferred content out there. We pushed it out. I cannot tell you enough. And this is why it's cheap. Like the Israeli security concept of behavioral-based detection modules are $60 a piece. Man, that's worth at least $300 or $400 if you had to go take that somewhere else. It's 4 hours or 3.5 hours online. It's going to help you see this and many other undesirable events before they occur. And you can like watch it in your underoos or your Ren and Stimpy pajamas or whatever you're wearing to bed, like when you wake up, while you're eating your chocolate chip pancakes. And yeah, I know they're in the afternoon on Sundays, but still, I'm not going to say anything. You can cut your camera off. I won't even call on you. But those are the two most important modules, Module 1 and 2, behavioral-based threat detection. And we've got one coming up, and then we've got one, I think, in November, Module 2 in November. Those are very important for you guys to prevent. It's what the Israeli security folks have been using in the airline industry or their airline industry for years, and they're throwing a bunch of other physical security stuff in there to help you. And it's pennies based on what it's worth. I learned that in Israel. I've learned it through private groups. It is really inexpensive, and it's going to be the thing that's going to help you prevent this stuff. And if you need a standard, look at our CPS, man. It's packed full of information, packed full of certifications. There's a number of certifications you get in there, and now we have a two-year renewal process because there's certifications in there that are good for 2 years. Any other questions? All right, that's it. I'll shut up. Hey, be careful. Review your open source intelligence. Sign up for our behavioral-based threat detection stuff. Please, it is worth it. It is going to help you prevent this stuff. And remember, first of all, we love you. If you're out there protecting your synagogue, your mosque, your church, we're thinking about you. Be careful. If you've got a question, send us an email. We'll respond back to you with some kind of bullet point answer. And always remember, it's about prevention, not response.